Okay, good afternoon and welcome to Eliza Raine, an intriguing life from India to Osbaldwick. And before I introduce Jude Dobson, we'd like to remind you that the session is being recorded and that there are closed captions available. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat and we'll get through as many as we can at the end. And just one final reminder that some of the pictures and images that we're going to share with you today aren't necessarily available in the public domain, and Jude has actually paid for permissions to share them. So we'd really request politely that you don't take screenshots throughout the session, but hopefully you'll find them really interesting. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Jude Dobson to the Amnesty Research Summit. Jude lives in Halifax and has an interest in local history, which has turbo boosted when Gentleman Jack hit the TV screens. She enjoys visits to the archives and to the local studies department at Halifax Central Library. And she has a particular interest in Eliza Raine's story, which has taken her on archive adventures to York, North Yorkshire, and to London. So to start us off, Jude, can you tell us what we know about Eliza's early life and the voyage she took from India to England?
There are some records of Eliza and her sister Jane's baptism. So we know that from the records that they were baptised in a church at Vepuri, which is in Madras. The girl's father, is Dr. William Raine. He was a surgeon in the Honourable East India Company. And he was based at Fort St. George, which was established by the East India Company in the 1680s, and then the town of Madras and subsequent city grew up around the fort. So that's situated on the southeast coast of India, so quite a long way from here. It wasn't uncommon at the time for British men in the East India Company to take local Indian wives, and this is what happened with Dr. Raine. He had been a prisoner of war in the 1780s at Bangalore, and there are letters in the Calderdale archive where he writes as a prisoner to his colleague William Duffin, who will feature later. The baptism record for Jane, Elizabeth Raine, was she was baptised on the 17th of October 1789. Now, her dad, William Raine, is noted as an Esquire, and mother unknown, but on that record there's no date of birth for Jane, unfortunately. We can only assume it was either a month or two or even longer before that she was born. The baptism record we've got for Eliza, it took me a while to find this because her dad's name, it wasn't down as William Raine, but just Raine spelt with an E. So it took a bit longer to try and find that. It was noted as a doctor, as occupation. Again, mother unknown. She was baptised on the 14th of April 1792, and her date of birth is recorded as the 13th of July 1791. So it took a while before she was baptised. So Dr. Raine's house was called Myrtle Grove, and it was on an area called Chaltry Plain. I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly. So the house appears in the Madras Courier, local paper, and it states that it's to sell by public outcry. I think this means an auction at the Seagate at 11 o'clock on the 25th of May 1792. There is a later advert to be found, and that says that Dr. Raine's carriage and horses were being sold, and that was the same address was given, but it was 2 years later in 1794. So I think we can safely say that Eliza and Jane, grew up in at this house, Myrtle Grove. Eliza and Jane then set off to England in 1797. She left. They both left mother and father behind in Madras, set off on their own. There's a record of the East India Company ship called the King George, which set sail from Madras on the 17th of October 1797. So at this time, Eliza was 6 years old and Jane, we presume, about 8 years old. The India office records are held in the British Library now in London, and these include the East India Company ship logs. Jane and Eliza were passengers on the passenger list seen in the slide, and they were listed as age 6 and 5. They got the ages slightly wrong and also the wrong way around, but never mind. So also on board, setting off sail from Madras, was Colonel Coopage and 6 children. They ranged from sort of 2 to teenagers, and there was also a French servant, Louisa. So we don't know whether Louisa was looking after the Coopage children as well as Eliza and Jane, but I expect that she was at least looking after those 2. The ship actually takes over 8.5 months to get to England. I think it actually goes via the bottom of Africa, and also there's a stop off in Cork as well, I think, in Ireland. So Eliza and Jane depart the ship at a place called Downs, which is on the south coast of England, and that's on the 7th of July 1798. So that's when they arrive in England.
Brilliant. So there's a lot of stuff there about the little, probably more than we expected, that we know about Eliza and Jane and their early life in India, and then taking that voyage over to England. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit, if that's okay. And I mean, it's fairly well known that Anne Lister and Eliza met in York. So what do we know about the time between Eliza landing in England in 1798 and them later meeting at the Manor School?
So there's very little information to tell us about, what happened in the 6 or 7 years after the girls arrived in England. We can safely assume that Eliza and Jane were in York most of the time with the Duffins, because the Duffins were, Mr. Duffin was the guardian to the girls. We know also about William Raine, what happened to him, because he set off to return to England, and it was on another East India Company ship called Asia, and this was about 2 years after Eliza and Jane had set off in early 1800. The ship log records that he was accompanied by Jonathan Raine, and it's thought that this was likely a servant. Before the ship got to St Helena, an island off the coast of South Africa, I think, Dr. Raine died on board, unfortunately. On the 6th of July, 1800, the captain, Robert Wardlow, he wrote in his logbook, 7:30 AM, departed this life, William Raine, late head surgeon of the Madras establishment. And then the following day, again in the logbook, at 5 PM, committed the body of the deceased to the deep. So quite dramatic, but confirms that he was actually buried at sea. In the Shibden papers, there's a scrap of paper, not the one on the screen, but another one, and it's entitled Ladies at Mrs. Cameron's School in 1803. So it gives a timetable of lessons, a list of day pupils, the boarders, and teachers as well. So Eliza was noted on this paper about Mrs. Cameron's School as being age 12, and Jane was 14, and they were from York. So the school was based in Tottenham in London. Basically, I know nothing else about it. I think people have tried to find out more. There's also copies of William Raine's will and inventory. Now, the inventory is about what was in his trunks. He had 2 trunks when he was on the ship, and the captain ordered one of the men to basically write a list of the contents. So that's actually still survived in the archive, which is quite interesting. In his will, he left money in trust for his daughters. So there was 20,000 star pagodas, and apparently that was equivalent to about £8,000 each, which was quite a fortune at that time. So in his will as well, the education and care, William Raine left in the hands of Dr. Duffin, who was a colleague and another surgeon. I think he was head surgeon before Raine. So William Duffin was in Madras up to 1792, and then he returned to York with his wife, and as far as I can tell from the records, he didn't return to India. He did intend doing, and asked if he could return, into his job, but then he obviously must have decided against that. So he certainly didn't return to take the girls back after William Raine's death. So William Duffin had a house at 58 Micklegate in the city, and he also had a country residence at Monkton, which was called Red House. I think it was actually rented, and it was owned by the Slingsby family, big landowners there. So Anne tells us that she met Eliza when she was 14, when they were both at the Manor School, and the Manor School's at King's Manor in York. It's a very, very old building. It's still standing. And at the time, this was also known as Mr. Lumley's School of the Ladies. Again, we've got another scrap of paper, which is the one on the screen, and that shows us the pupils. It lists the pupils at Manor School in the year 1805. I think it says up to the Christmas term, something like that, and also which bedrooms they were in. So Eliza and Anne shared the attic bedroom, and that was known as the slope.
Fantastic. So you've talked about there being kind of a scrap of paper here and maybe a record here and there. What else is available in the archive that relates to Eliza, and what does this tell us about where she lived or stayed after the period of time that she spent at the Manor School?
So the Calderdale archive holds the Shibden Hall collection. It's very well documented and listed. Now, in Anne Lister's correspondence, there's a box of 93 items all relating to Eliza Raine. The reference number for that, which will be at the end of the session as well, it's SH7 MLA. My understanding is ML stands for Miss Lister, but people may disagree, I don't know. So mostly the letters in this box are from Eliza to Anne, but she also sends letters to other family members. For instance, Mrs. Lister, the Rebecca, the mum to Anne, and she's corresponding with Anne's brother as well. So the box includes a book of poetry and French translations, so it's not just letters. There's a diary, which was mentioned in the session yesterday from the Search Van Walker people. And we've also got a few draft letters from Anne, so presumably those are letters that she then rewrote out and sent to Eliza. So the letters are from, the first sort of letters are from 1805 from Manor School, and they range up to the end of December 1814, when Eliza was admitted to the private asylum in Clifton. The letters help us track Eliza's movements between these years, 1805 to 1814. Anne's journals have some early years missing, so it's also helpful that we've got some letters in the general ML collection which mention Eliza. Eliza, we know, stayed in York when she finished school, and at some point she agreed to go and stay with a cousin, Lady Crawford. That was around early 1810. Lady Crawford lived in Doncaster. She didn't like it. It was awful. So after just a few months, Eliza planned to return to York, where she then, wanted to arrange a move to Halifax. This was probably to be closer to Anne. Didn't quite work out that way, because Anne then went back to York when Eliza came to Halifax, more or less. It's not, there was some overlaps. So Eliza moved to Halifax in June 1810, and she lived with the Miss Mellins, and they were teachers that were known to Anne, who lived at Blackwall, which you may be able to see on the map. It's very close to the Trinity Church, which I think is the black building on the right hand side of the map. So after a few months, she moved into a house of her own, which is at Savile Row, which is the photo that I took earlier this year. She had a maid, and she bought furniture for the place. Unfortunately, I don't know which house it is, but the numbers go from left to right, 4, 3, 2, and 1, and the middle two terraces were made into one at some point. So in Halifax, she had a lot of attention from a couple of naval officers, and that included Captain Alexander, who was also quite well known to Anne. She knew the family in Halifax, and that included the Lister family. So after about 18 months, she left Halifax and returned briefly to York. And then she went on to Hotwells, which is in Bristol, and that was around December 1812. The move to Hotwells was on the advice of the doctor for health reasons, but it was probably also so she could be close to Anne, who was going to be staying in Bath with the Norcliffes for a number of months. So we then have an advert which advertises furniture for sale when Eliza's moving back to York and then Hotwells, and she's back with the Duffins after Hotwells by March 1813. So a bit of movement around sort of York and Halifax and Hotwells and back to York. We also know from the letters that she had visits with the Norcliffes, and also a widow called Lady Horland at Sutton Hall towards the end of that year, I think that was. So in June 1814, she moved into her own lodgings at Blake Street in York, and towards the end of that year, she was placed under the care of Dr. William Belcombe at his private asylum in Clifton. There's no more letters after the end of December 1814 from or to Eliza, and the last one was dated the 27th of December 1814 when she was in Clifton Asylum. There's about 9 items in a folder of correspondence within the Crowness papers at Calderdale Archive. These seem to all relate to either Eliza or William Raine's will, and the dates are from 1808 to 1815. Why they're in the Crowness papers, I can't tell you. It seems a bit of a strange thing, really. It may be that they were passed on to Anne, who then passed them on to Anne Walker, and then that's how they've ended up in the Crownest. Or it could be that they were at Shibden Hall and got mixed up with Captain Sutherland's sort of papers. Who knows? After she was admitted to Clifton, we've got some mentions of Eliza in Anne's journals. Anne wrote about periodic visits, and she had news about Eliza also in letters from either Mr. Duffin or Miss Marsh. So that's kind of gives us a flavour of how Eliza was getting on.
Excellent, thank you very much. So we mentioned earlier that Eliza had an older sister, Jane. What happened to Jane? Were they able to keep in touch?
Jane's is a really tragic tale. I'd like to thank Stan Riaken for the research that she shared with me about Jane and the Raine family. It's very, very in depth. So after school, Jane stayed in Doncaster with a cousin, Lady Crawford. Like Eliza, after her, she didn't really get on with Lady Crawford, and she returned after a number of months back to York. And it's also, noted that she'd visited her uncle James in Scarborough. So this is William Raine's brother. Lady Crawford was the daughter of William Raine's sister. So it's all on William Raine's sort of side of the family. In early 1808, Jane met an army cadet called Henry Bolton, who's from Malton, near York. It's also near where Langton Hall is. And he was stationed in Calcutta, and he worked in the East India Company Army. They were married by licence. We've got a record of that at Holy Trinity Church, which is on Micklegate in York. And that was on the 21st of May, 1808. Jane was only 19 and Henry was 21. So the local paper in York tells us that Jane was an accomplished young lady with a handsome fortune. So don't seem ashamed to say that she was rich. She was rich, and that might be why he was interested. So she inherited money according to her father's will when she married, before she reached the age of majority, 21. But her money would have automatically gone to her husband. So that was kind of the law of the land at that time. The couple moved out to India, where Henry was stationed, and Henry subsequently bought an ensign commission. That's kind of a promotion in the army, but they've got to pay for it, basically. Things went pretty badly wrong for the couple, and Jane was abandoned by her husband, from what we can establish. She made her own way to England and ended up as a prisoner for a time on the continent. On her return to England in April 1810, Jane was pregnant and without her money, without a fortune. She had a baby boy, which was probably quite scandalous. A lifestyle of lovers and drinking was frowned upon, and Eliza and the Duffins seemed to keep the distance from her. Jane is mentioned again in 1813. She writes to Eliza, and then she also visits her in York. By the summer of 1814, Eliza had fallen out with the Duffins and Miss Marsh, and Jane turned up at the lodgings in what's noted as a deranged state. Now, Eliza took her in for a few days, and then she went to London to seek help for Jane. She was acting on her own, so because she'd fallen out with the Duffins. A family who'd helped Jane before arranged for her to see a doctor, and this was with a view to her being looked after in an asylum. So what we know is Mr. Duffin and Miss Marsh found out, and they weren't happy about this. Jane ended up staying in lodgings in London, and the asylum plan was thwarted. This episode is likely to have contributed to Eliza's deteriorating mental health in the later part of 1814. I've not seen any mentions of contact between Eliza and Jane after 1814. Jane's son, we don't know the name. He died aged 6 in 1817. And Henry Bolton was now a lieutenant in the army, and he died at Multai camp in India, and that was in October 1818. Now, Henry's death was reported in the York papers, but it was almost a year later after his death. There was no mention of Jane in the obituary, and he, as far as I'm been told, he died without a will, intestate, so his money went to the treasury. And then in November 1819, Jane died. She died of consumption, and her death was announced in the York Herald as a widow of Lieutenant Henry Bolton of the East India Company and cousin of Lady Crawford. Those two things were mentioned. She died on the 24th of November at her lodgings in Clarendon Square, London.
Great, thanks, Jude. It's really interesting that Jane wasn't mentioned in Henry's death notice, but Henry was mentioned in Jane's. Really, really interesting. So I'm just very conscious that we've got around sort of 10 to 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we've got time for some questions, but we've got one final question. So we're gonna skip ahead in time a little bit, and we're going to sort of cover something that, now, am I right in thinking that Eliza was declared a lunatic and that she might have been under the care of Dr. Belcombe, who is the friend of Anne Lister? And was that the same doctor who then later treated Anne Walker?
It's the two different doctors, a dad and a son. So right. By October or November 1814, she was under the care of Dr. Belcombe Senior, which was William Belcombe. He was Mariana's father, and obviously well known to Anne, the whole family was, and probably also to Eliza as a prominent York doctor. He'd opened a private asylum with another medical man in a village a couple of miles out of York at Clifton. It would have been, it's now a suburb, but it would have been a village at that time. Things were unravelling for Eliza by the time she was at Lake Street, which was lodgings in York. She'd fallen out with the Duffins and Miss Marsh. Helping Jane had backfired on her. She was probably feeling really isolated. There was mention in letters of no visitors for weeks and not eating. So she really wasn't looking after herself. The reports from Miss Marsh were of erratic and challenging behaviours. So initially, Eliza went in and out of the asylum and then back in for an extended period in 1815. But by May the following year, 1816, she was a permanent resident at Clifton Green, and didn't visit Eliza until 1817. From the information we've got available, her journals are missing for some of the earlier period, although there are letters that do cover that period. So she may have visited her, but when it's first mentioned, it was a couple of years after she'd gone into the asylum. So by the time Eliza had been declared, by the time Anne visited, Eliza had been declared a lunatic by an Inquisition of Lunacy, which was the official term. The Inquisition was actually held at Clifton Green, at Dr. Belcombe's house, and it included 3 officials. They were sort of commissioners of the Court of Chancery, and a jury of 13 men. On the 6th of June 1816, which is when the the Inquisition was held, it was found that Eliza could not govern herself or her estate, and they said that had happened since December 1814. I'm getting mixed up with my centuries. In the York Explorer archive, there's 2 grants of custody. One is from 1818 and the other from 1840, after Mr. Duffin had died. So on the first grant of custody, William Duffin and the solicitor Robert Swan are named as committee of the estate, and Lady Crawford committee of the person. After Jane had died, Lady Crawford removed Eliza from the asylum to live with her in Doncaster. So that was in January 1820. The arrangement didn't last long. Eliza was placed under the care of her Mrs. Barker and her two daughters in an area which is known as the Groves in York. There was a scandal in 1819 at Clifton Asylum, and that probably influenced Lady Crawford in not putting Eliza back into the asylum. So Eliza stayed with Mrs. Barker for the next 16 years. We know that from a letter that Miss Marsh had written to Anne, saying that she'd looked after her for over 16 years. Anne tells us about occasional visits with varying accounts of Eliza's state of mind and the reception that she received when she visited. So by 1835, things were breaking down at Mrs. Barker's, and there were reports of Mrs. Barker not being able to manage Eliza's behaviours. Mrs. Barker placed an advert in the York paper in March 1836, and she was advertising a vacancy at Grove Cottage. That's obviously what the house name was. There's a record of admission to Clifton Green in July 1836. And this was under the care of Dr. William Belcombe's son, Mr. Henry Stevens Belcombe, also known as Steph, or Marianne's brother. And it's Steph Belcombe who was involved with the care of Anne Walker. There's an anomaly where Eliza's address is recorded as Terrace House on the 1840 grant of custody. This new grant had named Jane Duffin, widow, as the committee of the person, and the care and management of the lunatic's estate was to John Swan, Esquire, who's a solicitor in York. So Eliza's recorded on the censuses of 1841 and 1851 as living at Clifton Green, so we can place her there. There's a record from September 1843, and that tells us that Eliza was living at Clifton Green under Dr. Henry Stephen Belcombe's care. Dr. Belcombe Jr. retired in 1853, and in doing so, he gave up the asylum. He sort of sold the building to a local school, I think. There's a national register of private asylum admissions, and that information in there tells us that Eliza was admitted to Terrace House on the 10th of November 1853. So there's a Mrs. Elizabeth Toes, who was the proprietor at Terrace House. She was the person who applied every year for a licence to run a private asylum in Osbaldwick, and she was there for a lot of years. I've not seen any evidence to suggest Eliza and Anne Walker were in the same place at the same time. Having said that, there are a few days unaccounted for between Anne leaving Shibden Hall and being admitted to Terrace House on the 12th of September 1843. We don't know for sure what happened, I think, in those few days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so I'm very conscious that we're kind of heading towards the end. I think we've got a few minutes that we can go over to make sure. There's been some fantastic questions coming in. But we know that lots of people like to go and visit the people in Anne's life and that are part of Anne's sort of story. And I'm sure many of the people watching will want to go and find out what happened to Eliza and where she kind of where her life came to an end, and whether or not they can go and visit her too. So what do we know about Eliza's death? And are we able to go and visit her gravestone? Does she have a gravestone?
She does have a gravestone, yes. It's at St Thomas's churchyard in Osbaldwick. So we know from records that she died on the New Year's Eve 1860, and that would be 20 years after Anne Lister had died. She'd spent the last 7 years of her life at Terrace House. The death certificate tells us that Eliza, a spinster and gentlewoman, died of a hemorrhage of the stomach and bowels. which sounds quite painful. Hannah Keeble was present at the death, and she was the person also reporting the death to the authorities. Now, Hannah was a matron at Terrace House, or a senior carer, but she was also the sister of Mrs. Toes. I managed to find them in an 1871 census when they were living somewhere else in York. So there's a burial record which tells us that Eliza was buried at St Thomas's on the 5th of January 1861. The gravestone's actually short, as you can see in the picture, shorter than it used to be. It deteriorated crossways, I think, and then fell over. So it was kind of cut in, made shorter. The villagers, I was told by somebody, had actually, put it back upright in quite fairly recent times. There was also on the records, there's letters of administration, which happens after somebody dies. It's in place of a will. And that was granted 23rd of November 1861. The document records that she died on the 31st of December 1860 at Osbaldwick, and then it says aforesaid, a spinster and a bastard, which is pretty, it also says a lunatic, I think, on that document, which is pretty awful. The personal estate of about £8,000 was granted to the solicitor to Her Majesty's Treasury, so money went to the state. You can visit the gravestone. It's really only a very short distance from what used to be Terrace House. It's in the corner of the churchyard in Osbaldwick.
Fabulous. And I'll just take us back to that map and the image that you found of Terrace House, so people know what to look out for if they are interested in going to see Eliza's gravestone. Thank you so much, Jude. There is so much that we can pack into what is a relatively short space of time for all of your years of research. I'm going to now have a look at some of the questions that have been coming in, and we'll take around 10 minutes or so, if that's okay, to answer some of these. So the first question is relating to whether or not it was common practice for children that young, so 6 and 5, to be sent from India to England. So I guess it was quite common for school, but what about just to be sent entirely without returning?
I don't know how common it was. There is a similar sort of case where that has been written about, because it involved a famous law case about a girl called Jane Cumming. Now, she was sent over as well. I'm not quite sure what age, but she was sent over from India. She was also sort of mixed heritage. Father being sort of a Scottish captain, I think, in the East India Army. So, as I say, I don't know what age she was, but it was a very similar situation in that the family decided she needed to be educated in Britain. It was Scotland, actually, but yeah. Okay,
great. So there's a couple of questions that have come in on the sort of a common theme, and that is kind of intrigue and curiosity about Eliza and Jane's mother. So do we know kind of, would they have gone through a formal marriage ceremony, or do we actually know what became of her?
I think San had actually found a record which indicated that she died a couple of years after, in sort of the early 1800s. I can't remember the date, because it's a record of the estate management, basically what they did with Dr. Raine's money afterwards. And he pays like an allowance to what's called his woman, Mr. Raine's woman kind of thing. Obviously, it doesn't mention what her name is. I did that at all. But it does pay an allowance to presumably be able to live at the house that they had in Madras, because it also pays for the gardener. Right. And I think the gardener gets almost as much as she does on a monthly allowance. But it was also noted that, you know, at some point that stopped because she died. So I don't think there's any, I'm not aware anyway of any other record to say that she died. It was likely that she wasn't Anglican, and I think because of that reason she wouldn't be sort of recorded in the you know, in the church documents. So going back to the baptism, it says mother unknown. That wasn't just for her. There was a lot of records in that baptism sort of book that says mother unknown, and you can only presume it's because it's an Indian woman, or that, you know, they're not of the Anglican faith.
So it wasn't necessarily that they were unknown, it's just that for the public record they were stated as unknown.
She obviously was known as Dr. Raine's woman, and, you know, was supported after his death with money from the estate. So but yeah, I don't think there's any official record of sort of marriages, but there might have been some sort of local, you know, ceremony. But it was certainly not an uncommon thing for the, you know, British men to have an Indian sort of wife, or wife without being legal.
Absolutely. We've had quite a few questions come in the chat around kind of conditions in kind of the asylum and how that kind of all worked. I'm not going to touch on them today, but there have been previous sessions at the summit. So if you are interested in kind of finding out a little bit more about lunacy proceedings and conditions in asylums, etc., do have a look at the YouTube channel to see if you can find some of the answers there. But coming back to kind of you, Jude, did we find any, or did you find any, has anybody found any information about why Eliza was a boarder but Jane wasn't?
No, that's kind of a mystery, really, because you know, they were both living fairly nearby, so could have easily have been sort of, you know, day boarders, day
yes,
as opposed to boarders. But you know, for some reason, whether it was because she was younger and Jane was more sort of independent and could go home, you know, after school, I don't know. It's a bit odd. But well, yeah, she was that a bit older. She was probably, if Eliza was 14 when she went to Manor School, then Jane would have been 16.
Right.
But I think it's not like our sort of school age. You know, I think there were older girls attending the schools at that time.
Yeah.
There wasn't sort of a cut-off time. You know, I think there might have been some sort of late teens or 20s that were at the school.
Yeah. Okay. I think, I don't know whether it was you or somebody else, Jude, that described to me kind of that Eliza's story in particular is kind of a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. So we know quite a few bits now as people have done more research like yourself, but there's still a few bits that we haven't quite pieced together. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. And just a clarity point here, Jude. Terrace House, that being the same place that Anne Walker was when she was put under Dr. Belcome's care, is that right?
That's it, yeah.
Yes.
So it was, it wasn't owned by Dr. Belcome. I think he was one of the visiting, you know, physicians. But in Anne's case, yes, she was at Terrace House at 1843, I think, from admitted 12th of September 1843, and I'm not sure that it's recorded exactly what date she was discharged, but it was, into the sort of springtime the following year. But yeah, it was, there's a record that says she was at Terrace House 1843, and likewise there's a record that says Eliza was at Clifton Green at the same time, you know, at 1843.
Yeah, so they were cared for potentially in the same place, but not necessarily at the same time.
We're definitely in the same place, but in different times.
Yeah.
From what we've got from the records, but as I say, there is a very slight possibility that Anne might have gone to Clifton prior to going to Terrace house, but I don't think anybody's been able to say that for definite.
Right. Okay, great. There's a question here, Jude, and I think it's probably going to be the final one of the session. To what extent did race play a role in the social difficulties that Jane and Eliza may have faced throughout Halifax and York, given that they had wealth at some point? And is there any kind of writings from Anne Lister that are unfavourable about Eliza's race?
I think what has been sort of unearthed, if you like, is there was a letter from Miss Marsh to Anne that had sort of quite racist undertones, because she talked about a black blood of Eliza, and it was around the time that things were going very wrong, and she had ended up in the asylum.
Right.
So yeah, I'm quite sort of aware that it's there, and it probably had a bearing on a few things, but exactly to what extent, I don't know. I mean, some people sort of blame, have seemed to have come out and blamed Anne for Eliza going a bit, deteriorating with her mental health. But I'm quite sure there was a lot of factors, and one of those factors probably was how society had treated her as a mixed heritage sort of. So I think while she was behaving herself, she was probably quite accepted, and might have even been treated as a bit of a curiosity.
Right.
But once she turned a corner and wasn't as sociable, and her behaviours were getting more erratic, I think things sort of very quickly turned against her.
Yeah. And that's where perhaps it was more unfavourable, and her behaviours were seen more unfavourably.
Yeah, I mean, we know today it's disproportionate. The number of black people are part of the
no, absolutely
mental health system, and it could well have been even worse at that time. But
right, no,
I'm pretty sure that it plays a part in what happened.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're probably going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for everybody's questions. I'm really sorry if we didn't manage to get to yours, but this has been absolutely wonderful, Jude. It's been 3 years in the making, and we're really, really glad that you've been sort of wanting to come and share all of your fantastic research with us as part of the summit this year. So thank you very much. I'm just going to make sure that we can share your details on the slide, so people know how to get in touch with you if they want to follow up with you on anything, or ask you any questions, or find out some more of those references. And in terms of the rest of the summit, we've got some fantastic sessions this afternoon about other women in Anne Lister's life. And then we're going to round off our summit with the peak party later on. So we really hope that you're able to join us for that. Thank you again, Jude. This has been really, really wonderful. And I think we'll close the session there.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Thank you.